So as you know, the name of this unit is titled Ethical Theories and Applications. The first half of this unit, we were looking at different theories for what makes an action moral or immoral. Right? What were the three theories that we looked at? Who can remember? What was the first one we looked at? Yeah?
It's like your intentions.
Yeah, it was Kant's view, right? We called this deontology, coming from the Greek word deon, meaning duty. And for Kant, the morality of an action had to do with whether or not the person's intention was good, or to be a little bit more nuanced, whether or not it flows from our duty, whether or not the principle that motivated the action is universalizable, that kind of stuff. We contrasted that view with a consequentialist view. What was the second view that we looked at?
Utilitarianism.
Right, and what was the morality of an action according to utilitarianism? How was that determined?
It was kind of like based on like your consequences, like what happened like after like an action occurred.
Exactly. Whereas Kant thought that we could determine the morality of an action before it was ever done, just by looking at the person's intentions and rationality, the utilitarians are going to say no. It has everything to do with the consequences of the action. Okay, so it doesn't matter what your intentions are. It doesn't matter if you wanted something good to happen. Did you make the world a better place, basically, as a result of your action? Did you raise the happiness levels in the universe? And then we looked at one more view. What was the third view that we looked at? Yeah?
It was like the virtue theory.
Yeah, and what did that theory say? Can you remember anything about it? You remember who put it forth? Ancient Greek dude? Aristotle, right. And he wasn't so much focused on determining what makes an action moral or immoral, but what? Does anybody know? Anybody remember? Well, what's his view about? What are we supposed to be doing if we want to live happy, healthy, moral lives?
It's like make yourself wise and good. You'll do like lots of good things.
Right. Yeah. We have to work on our characters. Right? We have to establish certain habits of life so that when the situation presents itself, we just do the good thing naturally. We have to cultivate what he calls the virtues, or certain dispositions towards thinking and acting in certain ways. We got to become the best version of ourselves as possible. And naturally, then we'll do the wise and good things. Well, we're switching gears a little bit today. Instead of looking at ethical theories, now we're going to look at some ethical issues that face us, and that face us as members of society. We're going to look at two for the rest of this unit, which you voted on. Today we're going to be looking at capital punishment. So, is it ever moral or immoral to kill someone as a punishment for their crimes? Think about that in the back of your head as we go through this. To do that, we're going to be investigating a philosopher named Louis Pojman. There's a picture of him, presumably with his granddaughter, that I pulled from his website. Unfortunately, Dr. Pojman is no longer around. He died in 2005. But he is was an American philosopher who was very influential when it came to producing educational materials and writing on a wide variety of topics, such as ethics and social political theory. He wrote a lot on different cases in applied ethics. So, taking these ethical theories that we've been looking at and applying them to the ethical issues that we face in our lives, such as the death penalty, such as immigration, such as the relationship of society to religion, stuff like this. He's what is known as a philosopher working in the analytical tradition. You don't need to know this, but within the history of philosophy, it's become widely accepted that there is a split between what's called analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. Continental philosophy is associated a lot with these different German thinkers who are very flowery in their prose and kind of mystical and feely in their language and in their thoughts, whereas analytic philosophy is what you think of kind of when you think of science. Very analytical, definition-based, by the book, deductive arguments, no flowery language here. So he's working within the analytic tradition. He actually went to seminary before he got his PhD in philosophy. So he is a religious thinker in some instances. His writings have a religious component to it. But as we'll see today, he's not going to be basing any of his philosophy on the existence of God. Although he may have personally had a belief in the Christian God, what we're going to be investigating today is just very logical, rational arguments for the existence of capital punishment. He's not going to be relying on God's existence like Descartes or Berkeley in order to motivate some of his claims. Okay. So we're talking about capital punishment. That is, killing someone as a punishment for their crimes. Pojman says that there are basically two different views that someone can use to justify this practice. The backward-looking view and the forward-looking view. The backward-looking defense basically says that, look, human beings have an intrinsic dignity, they have some intrinsic worth, and if and when they commit murder, they forfeit their right to life. And so they deserve to die as punishment for their crimes. Pojman likens this view to more deontological theories like Kant's theory. The idea is something like, we have a duty to kill those who murder others. And that this is just to do. It is actually, this is what it means to carry out justice, to establish justice, is, in some sense, an eye for an eye. So the idea is something like when someone commits a murder, they forfeit the right to life that they have in virtue of being a human being, and the justifiable punishment for their crimes is death. This lines up neatly with Kant's view. Kant actually, famously, or infamously, was in favor of the death penalty. And he utilized some strange logic in order to do that. Kant basically said that if somebody commits murder, because he thought that morality was just a subset of rationality, somebody who commits murder, something has gone wrong in their rational faculties, and it's unlikely that they can't be rehabilitated. They're a monster. And so it's actually our duty to put a monster out of its misery. That was once human. So that's why we have to kill people who commit murders, Kant thought. Kind of a weird thing, right? We actually have a duty to kill the person. But we can contrast this view, this more deontological view, with the forward-looking defense, which is a more utilitarian view. It's a more consequentialist justification for the death penalty. And this view basically says that the reason why we punish people is so that we want to deter future crimes. Okay? The same thing applies to the death penalty. Because punishment should serve as a deterrent for crimes, the death penalty does serve as a sufficient deterrent, so it's justifiable that different states and different countries exercise capital punishment. You'll notice immediately that this is kind of a consequentialist view, right? The idea is something like the death penalty is justifiable because of the consequences that it brings about, right? It brings about a state of affairs in which there is less crime than there would have been if we didn't have the death penalty. because people don't want to die. People are afraid to die. And so the idea is, if we kill people as punishment for certain crimes, that's going to deter a whole bunch of crimes because people don't want to die. Right? They're going to know that, look, if I get caught killing someone, I might be put to death, so I'm just not going to murder in the first place. These are the two different views that people normally use to defend the death penalty. And Pojman is going to defend the death penalty in this article. I choose controversial pieces on purpose because I think they're very interesting. What he's going to be doing in this article is he's going to be combining both of these views. He thinks that both of these views are sound. He thinks both of them make sense. And he's going to be putting forth what he calls the two-pronged view, which combines the backward-looking and the forward-looking defense. And so in this piece, he's going to try to argue that both of these defenses are sound. That is, the arguments are valid and they're true. And he's going to try to defend this double-pronged or this two-pronged view from various objections. So throughout the course of this lecture, what I'm going to do is present to you Pojman's two-pronged view. And then later, we're going to talk about some objections that he considers and attempts to rebut. And then we will finish class by having a discussion about all this and see if you agree with it. See if you think Pojman is making sense here. So, does anybody have any questions before we get into the weeds here? Gosh, that thing is really good at shaking, isn't it? Any questions? Okay, then I'm going to go ahead. Let's start by looking at the first argument that Pojman puts forth for the death penalty. This is an argument that is reliant on that backward-looking defense that we just discussed. The first argument that Pojman puts forth relies on what's called a retributivist theory of punishment. Retributivism is basically a theory of punishment that argues that wrongdoers deserve to be punished proportional to their crimes as a matter of justice. So, if somebody steals something, it is just to punish them in a way that is proportional to their crime. If somebody murders somebody, it would be just, it is just, this view argues, to punish them in a way that is proportional to their crime. A simplified version of this is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Right? If somebody plucks out your eye, then it's just that their eye gets plucked out. Something like that. This isn't the only kind of retributist theory. Right? There might be punishments that are not the same thing that was inflicted upon you. Right? Maybe somebody stealing your wedding ring, the just punishment is that they have to pay $5,000, not get you a new wedding ring of the same type and kind. Right? So it doesn't have to be an eye for an eye in that sense. That's just one type of retributist theory. But the general idea is that, look, people should be punished for doing wrong things. It's just to punish them in a way that's proportional to the wrongness that they committed. Pojman makes it clear that this view, this theory of punishment, is different than revenge. Okay? A lot of people think that, our criminal justice system is just set up to get revenge on people. Well, maybe that's the case, but that's not the view that he's trying to put forth here. Okay? He's trying to argue this is just a rational, moral position. Okay? A retributivist theory of punishment is not the same as personal revenge. Personal revenge always seeks to get back at the other person for hurting you. That's not what a retributivist theory of punishment is trying to do. A retributivist theory of punishment ideally is trying to carry out justice. It sees justice as the person being punished in proportional to their crimes. Personal desire and revenge has nothing to do with it. It's just, look, this is fair because this is what you did. Does that make sense? And so what Pojman is going to say is, look, I hold this theory of punishment. I think this theory of punishment makes sense. And so the death penalty, that's a fitting punishment for people who commit acts of murder. And as we'll see, he actually thinks that it's a fitting punishment for other kinds of crimes as well. We'll talk about that later. At least in cases of murder, the death penalty is a fitting punishment. It's proportional to what the wrongdoer did. So it's just that they be killed. Pretty straightforward argument. The death penalty is justified because it's just to kill someone who murders. That's the punishment that fits their crime. Any questions? Okay, let's continue on to the second argument he gives for the death penalty. This one is based more in that forward-looking defense that we talked about at the beginning of class. It's based on a theory of punishment known as deterrence. Whereas retributivism says that punishment is a matter of justice, and punishment should be proportional to the heinous acts that people commit, deterrence says that actually punishment is a consequentialist thing. What we should be using punishment for is to deter people from committing future crimes. So, it's a theory of punishment that argues that punishing wrongdoers deters people from committing various crimes in the future. And on those grounds, on those utilitarian grounds, punishment is justified. Because it prevents further crimes from happening. It deters people from committing wrong acts. Now, Pojman spends a lot of time in this article going through various anecdotes, stories, and different studies and statistics to try to show that, yes, in a lot of instances, punishment does deter people from crimes. And more specifically, the death penalty, according to a lot of people who work in the criminal justice system, who have had interviews with criminals, also say that it serves as a sufficient deterrent for crimes. In those states in which the death penalty is upheld and taken seriously, there are lots of different anecdotes from law enforcement officers who have interviewed criminals who have basically said, yeah, if the death penalty wasn't in this state, I'd be more likely to kill people. But because it is, I worry about that. So I don't take a gun when I go and rob people because I know that a worse punishment is there for me. And if I accidentally fire it off, well, something bad could happen. But although Pojman does provide these anecdotes, these stories, these statistics, what he's going to end up saying is that the evidence is still a little bit ambiguous whether or not the death penalty serves as a sufficient deterrent. But if this stuff can be trusted, then capital punishment is justified on the grounds that, yeah, it deters people from killing others. It prevents murders in our society. So the death penalty is justifiable. Capital punishment is a justifiable thing. Now, again, there are a few different things that Pojman considers when discussing this second argument from deterrence. Okay? Because things aren't as neat and tidy as they would seem. For starters, it's not clear that capital punishment is a sufficient deterrent for murder. Okay, the evidence, you can find evidence on both sides. You can find studies that say it is a deterrent, and you can find studies that say no, actually it doesn't deter people from committing crimes at all. So, objectively, the evidence is a little bit ambiguous. And one of the reasons for this is, if you think about capital punishment in a state, or the death penalty being legal in some certain state, we can't know how many lives that it saves if it is a deterrent, right? We can only know how many people die in a state. We can't know how many lives it would save because it is legal in that state, right? Because all these people are alive. And it's not like anybody's going to spend all their time going around interviewing people and that information is not available, right? How would somebody know that they were about to get killed, but were stopped by somebody who's thinking, oh, the death penalty is actually legal in this state? So we can't know how many lives it saves. That kind of makes it difficult to determine if the death penalty is a sufficient deterrent, because we don't know this number. If this number is very small, then the death penalty doesn't do much. But if the number is very high, then it seems like the death penalty is, on utilitarian grounds, it's necessary. But we don't know what this number is, and we can't know. But Pojman actually brings up a few different interesting points regarding deterrence. And to do that, the first thing that he brings up is the idea that it's a deterrent makes rational sense. And he brings up the following thought experiment. He says, imagine we lived in a world in which after somebody murdered, immediately after they murdered someone, God struck them dead. Lightning bolt, boom, and they were just dead. In that world, do you think people would commit murder less often than they do in this world? Pojman is like, obviously that's the case. If people knew that they were going to die right after committing murder, for sure, 100% guaranteed. Every instance in which somebody committed a murder, they were struck dead a second later. Pojman is like, yeah, a lot less people would commit murder. So it makes sense that we think of it rationally as a deterrent. But there are things about capital punishment that Pojman thinks we could change in order to make it a better deterrent. Now maybe you think this is a little bit barbaric, but let's walk through what he has to say here. The first thing he says is, look, if we want people to take the law seriously, if we want to increase the death penalty in being a good deterrent, the first thing that we should do is we should have speedier trials. No more trials that are dragged out for 3 years at a time. Okay? Somebody who has to go through 3 years of legal proceedings is not going to be afraid to commit murder, because they'll have a long time to wait before they're ever killed, if it's even determined that they deserve to die. Okay? So if we want the death penalty to be a better deterrent, we should speed up trials. The second thing that we could do to make the death penalty a better deterrent is creating a more limited appeals process. He says, look, if you have people who commit murder and the evidence is clear that they committed murder, why would you allow them to go through this lengthy appeals process that just slows everything down and doesn't provide justice to the families in a speedy way? In cases in which the evidence is a little spotty, yeah, they should be allowed to appeal the conviction. But in cases in which the evidence is clear, why don't we make a more limited appeals process? He also says that we could make the death penalty a better deterrent of crimes by making executions more public. This is an interesting point, right? If you knew that your death was going to be something of a public show for people, would you be less likely to commit murder? Maybe, right? But if you knew you were just going to die somewhere in a cell where only your friends and family members were there and nobody else saw you, maybe you would be not so worried about committing murder. but maybe the idea of it being more public might make the death penalty a better deterrent of crimes. And then one thing that occurred to me while I was reading this article, this isn't something that Pojman says, but if we hypothetically wanted to make the death penalty, capital punishment, a better deterrent, why don't we try varying methods of execution? How are people killed in the United States now? Does anybody know if they're sentenced to death?
I think the last one was lethal injection. Like they don't really do like electrocution or anything like that as much anymore.
Right.
It's the lethal injection.
Right, it's lethal injection of various chemicals. Right, I think there are 3 different chemicals. One of them is like something of an anesthetic, and then the other 2 are some cocktail that ends up killing them. This isn't a particular flashy way of killing someone usually, right? If we wanted the death penalty to serve as a better deterrent, what if we just brought back the guillotine? What do you think? Would that make the death penalty a better deterrent? Yeah.
I feel like that would be bad, like not in the sense of like people being like deterred away, but like the government turning it into something bad.
Yeah?
Like,
Yeah?
I don't know what the right word for it is, but like falsely accusing people and being like the evidence is there, and then they, since it's so quick, they're dead.
Yeah.
Because it just sounds like we're going backwards with that.
Yeah, well, that's one of the objections that he's going to consider later. Is look, we've made mistakes when it comes to exercising capital punishment, right? Innocent people have died, and that's not good. We don't want that to happen. Maybe you think that's a good argument against capital punishment. You know, look, we make too many mistakes for this to be illegal. Like, we shouldn't be doing this. Well, what do you think? Do you think these would make the capital punishment a better deterrent? If that's something that we wanted to do as a society? Or do you just think capital punishment is so barbaric you're not even going to think about it? Yeah.
I think that people, no matter what, even if there is like a really bad punishment, I think they're gonna still do whatever they want. So it's like, I don't know, I guess you could have those other methods, but
I certainly agree there will be some people, right, who will just, do whatever they're going to do. This is often an argument that's brought out against gun control, right? Because people are going to say, well, look, if somebody wants to find a gun and kill somebody, they're going to do it, regardless of whether it's a gun-free zone, regardless of whether it's legal to carry a firearm, right? But do you think for some people, doing this might deter them from committing a murder that they might otherwise have done? I don't know. Again, we don't have the numbers of how many people this would save, right? So we don't have all the evidence that we need. But it's interesting to think about, right? In any case, Pojman brings up one more argument in favor of the death penalty. And this is one that he borrows from another philosopher who was working in this discipline for a while. It's called the best bet argument. It goes something like this. Even though we don't know for certain that the death penalty deters people from committing crimes, we should bet that it does. Because we're responsible for outcomes that result from not having capital punishment. What's the worst that happens if we do have capital punishment? Well, maybe in extreme cases we get it wrong sometimes. Maybe we kill 1 or 2 people that were innocent. But we kill murderers, primarily. If it turns out that it doesn't deter, we kill some murderers, and that's about it. But if it turns out that it does deter, We have killed murderers and we've saved a bunch of people from dying. And aren't innocent people's lives worth more than murderers? Pojman asks. Therefore, we should bet that the death penalty is a good deterrent. We should err on the side of killing murderers rather than letting innocent people die. What do you think of this argument? Even if we don't know for certain that it deters, it's morally preferable to kill murderers than let innocent people die. Think that makes sense? He likens this argument, or uses the image of a lighthouse to make the point a little bit more clear. We don't know how many ships a lighthouse saves, but we don't turn the light off, right? Similarly, we don't know how many people capital punishment saves, but that doesn't mean we should stop doing it. Because look, if it saves an innocent person, that seems worth it, right? But I don't know, maybe you disagree with that. Hopefully we can get some of y'all's opinions near the end of class. This is what he has to say about it. Suppose we choose a policy of capital punishment for capital crimes. That is, killing someone because they committed murder. In this case, we are betting that the death of some murderers will be more than compensated for by the lives of some innocents not being murdered, either by these murderers or by others who would have murdered. If we are right, we have saved the lives of the innocent. If we are wrong, we have unfortunately sacrificed the lives of some murderers. But say we choose not to have a social policy of capital punishment. If capital punishment doesn't work as a deterrent, we've come out ahead. But if it does work, then we've missed the opportunity to save innocent lives. If we value the saving of innocent lives more highly than we do the loss of the guilty, then to bet on a policy of capital punishment seems rational. Since the innocent have a greater right to life than the guilty, it is our moral duty to adopt a policy that has a chance of protecting them from potential murderers. And so he's put forth three different arguments for capital punishment, right? The first one says, look, it is just to punish people in proportional to their crimes. Killing a murderer is proportional to what they did, so it's justifiable. That was the first argument. The second argument was capital punishment serves as an effective deterrent, so it's saving innocent lives. It's a good thing. On utilitarian accounts, it's a good thing because it's preventing people from dying. It serves as a good deterrent, so it's justifiable. And then the third argument was the best bet argument. Even if we don't know that the death penalty serves as a good deterrent, we should bet that it does. It's rational to bet that it does and err on the side of killing guilty murderers rather than letting innocent people die. Because the lives of innocent people are worth more than the lives of guilty murderers. But obviously there are objections to these different arguments, right? These arguments aren't foolproof. The first one that he attempts to respond to is an objection that says, look, you can talk about retributivism all you want. Capital punishment really is just carrying out somebody's desire for revenge. Okay, that's all it is. Really what's going on when we kill people is just satisfying some desire that we have to get back on those who we think do wrong. It's morally unacceptable. Morally unjustifiable thirst for revenge. So we shouldn't do it. Well, how do you think Pojman is going to respond to this? Is it clear in all cases in which someone is killed that it's a result of revenge? That we're doing it for revenge? Maybe in some cases, like people kill out of revenge. But retributivism as a theory of punishment is not supposed to have anything to do with revenge. It's just saying, look, it's just that people experience a consequence that is proportional to the wrong that they did. It's just to do that. So he's going to say, look, retributivism is not about revenge. Okay, maybe in some scattered cases, people use retributivism as a mask, and it's really revenge going on behind the scenes. But the theory, the view that I'm putting forth, is not one that's based on revenge. I don't think revenge is good, Pojman is saying. Retributivism is impartial, and it's methodical, and it's supposed to be objective. Okay? It's not personal revenge. It is the carrying out of justice, he thinks. Personal feelings should have nothing to do with what the person is sentenced with and how the punishment is carried out. Okay? So he's just going to say, like, look, maybe you think all cases of killing a murderer is about revenge. First of all, I don't agree with that. But second of all, I'm saying also that's not the way it should be. It should be objective and methodical. And then he attacks this objection by basically saying that it does not address whether people should be punished or what punishment they should undergo. Okay? What retributivism states, the only thing that it states is people should be punished in proportional to their crimes. That's a just thing to do. That's what we ought to do. But this objection, it would seem to question the whole idea of punishment. Like, is it ever good to punish someone? Should we ever punish someone? And it seems like, yeah, we should in some instances, and we don't want to get rid of that. Okay? We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So this is the first objection that he considers. He considers three more. And because he's a religious thinker, the second one that he considers is actually an argument against the death penalty that some Christians have put forth. Here's how the second one goes. Capital punishment requires some sort of special authority that only God can give. That is, maybe the death penalty is justifiable, but carrying it out requires a special authority. An authority that only God has, that God has not given to anybody else. Right? According to Christianity, God is like the master of the universe, complete sovereign over the universe, who's at the top of the cosmic hierarchy, okay, has all the power, all the authority. God ultimately does what he says, what he determines, and we're all beholden to him. And so the way this argument goes is that, look, God hasn't given anybody the authority to kill others. Okay, only he has that authority. Pojman, of course, says this argument is actually a bad one because these people didn't read their Bible far enough. Okay? This biblical argument fails because it actually says in the New Testament that government is appointed by God to carry out the punishments for criminals. Okay? So the idea is something like, although God is master of the universe, God appoints certain members in governmental positions, in institutions, to wield authority on his behalf. And the Bible actually says, if you want to quote from the New Testament, the government does not carry the sword for nothing. And it makes it clear, Paul makes it clear in Romans, that We should submit to our governmental authorities because they are where they are, at least in part according to the will of God. And so they're wielding authority on God's behalf. So it's not the case that no one has this authority to kill people. The government does. And the Bible says that. So the government has the authority to punish people in this way. If we don't want to get into the religious aspect of this, well, we can just kind of fall back on this social political view, which stipulates that, look, the state or the government has the authority and perhaps the moral obligation to dispense justice. And so if we think that killing a murderer is what dispensing justice looks like, then look, they also have the authority to do that. Right? We don't allow vigilantes in our society. Part of adhering to the social contract of which we're a part is allowing the government to dispense out justice, or representatives of the government to do that, right? In our criminal justice system. So even in a non-religious argument, we recognize that the state or government has the duty and the authority to dispense justice. The third objection that Pojman brings up is this idea that Aurora brought up earlier. That the death penalty, maybe it shouldn't be implemented because mistakes happen. Okay? And we have killed innocent people in the past. Judges have got it wrong. The evidence pointed towards somebody, but it ended up being the case that they didn't do it. And they were actually executed. Right? They were sentenced to death. And mistakes have happened in the past. So on account of the fact that, look, this doesn't go perfectly and innocent people have been killed, the argument stipulates that we shouldn't have capital punishment. We shouldn't have capital punishment because it has resulted in the loss of innocent lives, because mistakes have happened. Well, what do you think Pojman is going to say about this? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
I feel like you'd say, like, the amount of innocent people that have died from this is less than the amount of innocent people that have died.
Yeah, so if we're going to use a utilitarian argument, we could weigh the different sides. We could say, okay, how many innocent people have been wrongly killed? And, what's our best guess as to how many people were saved? Yeah. Then, according to utilitarianism, whichever side weighs more, right, that's the one we should go with. He's going to say something a little bit more philosophically tricky. Like any good philosopher, he's going to say, you're saying something that it doesn't really have to do with our conversation here. Okay? First of all, he's going to say the occasional mistake is not grounds enough to ban it. Okay? It's clear that, look, we really haven't killed too many innocent people as a result of this. It's not like those numbers are very high. So, it's not enough to ban it. The death penalty seems to serve a useful and important function in society, both in establishing justice and operating as a deterrent. But further than this argument critiques how we're carrying out capital punishment, not capital punishment itself. Okay? So look, everybody can point to how the government does things and say, oh look, it's made a mistake here, it's made a mistake there. But that's not the same thing as attacking the policy, right? Or attacking the principle. He's saying, look, I disagree with the capital punishment being used to kill innocent people. I think that's a bad application of it. Irrational, improper, immoral. Yes, all those things. But this argument doesn't actually attack the death penalty as a policy itself. It just says, we're not always right in applying it. which is true. And Pojman would say, yeah, that sucks. But this is not a good argument against the death penalty or capital punishment as a principle. It's only an argument against the application of it in practice. You see the difference here between these two things? It would be like saying, look, traffic stops are bad because cops ended up pulling over innocent people and discriminating against them. And trying to say, therefore, we should make traffic stops illegal or no longer do traffic stops. And Pojman might say, the application of traffic stops are bad if they discriminate against people, but that application is not a good argument against the principle of traffic stops. Does that make sense? Just because something is done improperly doesn't mean that the principle or the policy is wrong. The last one is particularly germane for our times, the last objection that he considers. And this is one that I hear most often, at least when I'm reading literature about capital punishment. It's an argument which talks about how capital punishment has been used to discriminate against people. So historically, capital punishment has been used to discriminate against poor people, against disabled people, against black people. And so for that reason, capital punishment is unjustifiable. It's been used to discriminate against people unfairly and unjustly. Well, Pojman is going to say something similar in response to this objection that he said in the previous one. First of all, he's going to say, look, I agree that the application is wrong and has been unjust historically, but that doesn't mean that the principle is wrong. Right? That doesn't mean that capital punishment is wrong in and of itself. It just means that in the past people have used it for bad reasons and to do bad things. So that's the first way that he responds to this objection. The discriminatory application is bad, not the death penalty itself. If it wasn't carried out in a discriminatory fashion, well, the argument falls apart, right? Because the argument doesn't say anything about whether the death penalty is bad in and of itself. It just said that we've been using it wrong and for unjust purposes. And then the second thing he's going to say is, this isn't a good reason to ban a practice or make a policy illegal or to get rid of a law. If we had to toss out every law, he says, which has been abused, that would be disastrous for our society. Because every law, it seems, that we've ever come up with has been abused, has been used for discriminatory purposes at some point. And so if we had to toss out every law that was used for discriminatory purposes, that would be disastrous for us. So again, he's agreeing that the application of capital punishment has been wrong and bad in some instances. But he's saying that application is not good enough reason to say that the principle or the policy is bad in and of itself. And we should take care not to throw out laws or policies unnecessarily just because they've been abused in the past. Right? It's clear that every year in the U.S. people, subvert tax law or abuse tax law. Does that mean we should throw out every tax law? Pojman's going to say no. Tax law has a purpose, right? Just because some people have abused it doesn't mean we should throw it out. Doesn't mean the law itself is bad. So, what do you think of this issue? What do you think of capital punishment? Do you think it's moral? Do you think it's ever justifiable? Do you think it's always bad? Do you think there's a time and a place for it? I want to hear what y'all think. Don't be afraid to speak up, okay? Yeah.
I feel like there's a list that they created for like what is justifiable for the death penalty, and I think that's where it helps this a little bit. It's like, yeah, here's a list of things that, or here's a list of crimes that it's gonna most definitely have to be doing. And people see that, that does deter.
Okay.
So,
So you think it does deter sometimes. And because it deters, it's like, yeah, that's a good thing that people are not being murdered, right? Like,
most of the arguments are saying that if it is abuse, we could go backwards almost. Like when I was reading that, I was thinking about how they would just hang people and they don't entertain. Like,
yeah.
so like if it gets abused, actively abused, then things could be calm, but nothing, it hasn't long term been abused that difficult, well not that much since that period of time.
I know what you mean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
It was abused in the past, and maybe it's still abused a little bit now, but it's better than it was. Right? And maybe it's good enough, it's better enough that it's a justifiable practice now because it deters people from committing crimes. Yeah.
I don't really agree with it. Like, I don't really think that it should be in place. I just think that you kind of like playing wrong, like playing like you can decide someone's life.
And there's something wrong and improper about that.
I feel like there's a better way society can get through murder than killing people with murder.
Okay. Yeah, what do the rest of y'all think? Yeah, Ellie.
Well, also, you just have to take into consideration, most of the people on death row die long before they're ever scheduled to get executed. Just of natural causes. So, like, it's, in the long run, really not that different than just giving somebody life. Because the majority of them die before they're executed anyways.
That seems to be how it is in practice, right? People will spend years on death row. Is that good or bad? Should we have a snappier legal process? So people who are convicted of death, they get killed in a week? What do you think?
I feel like with what she said, because I thought of Jeffrey Dahmer, he got killed in prison before he even got executed.
Right.
And then another good example of that would be like Ted Bundy. He kind of like turned his whole trial into like an entertainment act to keep it running as long as he could.
Yeah.
And then he ended up being executed in the long run anyway. So like speeding it up would be helpful, but like with what I said earlier, if it's an innocent person, then that's also bad.
Right. Yeah, we don't want to be sending an innocent person to death.
Yeah.
Right? Do you think being killed or spending life in prison is a worse punishment? Let's say somebody plans a murder for 3 months, how they're going to do it, where they're going to put the body, and they kill the person, and they're arrested. What is the fitting punishment for that person? Is it X years in prison? Is it death? Or do you think we shouldn't even be talking about punishment at all, we should be talking about rehabilitation? What do you think?
I get the thing about like giving people second chances and all that, but once they do something that's like really bad, you know, just like how, yeah, you're not supposed to play God, like by taking their life, but they would like play God by doing that. So I
So like, maybe somebody who commits a lot of heinous acts, like a serial murder rapist, maybe they can't be rehabilitated. So then what punishment should they receive? Life in prison? Death? Something else?
I don't know, because, like, I think life in prison would, you know, if they're having it, like, not that great, you know,
Yeah.
but also, I think, with death, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's tough, right?
Yeah.
Because you can think about situations in which, look, life in prison would not be as bad as being killed. Depends on what prison you're in, right? If you're in a prison in Switzerland, they have very nice prisons, right? Well, not all of them, but so depends on where you're at. But then you can also imagine scenarios in which dying, killing them, is the more merciful thing to do, rather than spending 60 years in a hellhole prison. So in a backwards way, maybe it seems like sometimes killing them we have a moral obligation to do? What do you think about that? Is that crazy?
I feel like, with, oh gosh, what am I trying to think? What do I keep losing? With the long-term punishment, we don't really know what death looks like, any of us. So.
Yeah, we haven't experienced it, presumably. Or if there's anything after it, or.
I've heard people use the term that's the easy way out.
Mm.
So I'm like, okay, so is that really also a good punishment, depending on what it is? We don't really know. I say life in prison would be also horrible, because in the long run, you're taking care of them either way, and they're going to be a danger to the public probably. Because I feel like if you release someone after they commit that one murder and they have a problem, they're probably going to be. You just gave them a second chance for releasing them.
Mm-hmm.
That gives them the opportunity to do more. That's happened. I feel like I could probably like.
It's definitely
do
happened,
that.
yeah.
It's just not safe for the community to do things like that.
Yeah, it depends on who it is. It depends on, what their outlook is like, if they have an issue, how serious it is. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like if you look from like the family side, like if my family got murdered, like I wouldn't sleep like knowing that that person's still out there. Like I would always be like worried that they're gonna come back or like they're gonna break out of jail, even though like that's not like probable. I feel like you would just always be paranoid.
Okay. So then what would be the just thing to do? Like if your family was murdered, do you think that the killer should be killed? Like would that be a just punishment?
It would probably like make me sleep better at night, like knowing that they weren't still out there.
Yeah. Yeah, another thing to keep in mind too is, like, look, if we actually do want to engage in capital punishment, there are things that we could be doing as a society, that our government could be doing, that would be actually helping members of society a lot more. Because who pays often for these people to stay in prison, and for their food, and for all these services?
Our taxes.
In a lot of cases, the American taxpayer, right? So if we did decide that capital punishment was a justifiable thing in some instances, maybe we toss out the lethal injection because that's expensive. Maybe we only use the guillotine. That's going to save the taxpayer a lot of money, right? Maybe we don't. Maybe we make court cases snappier, a little more limited appeals process. It's almost as if we as a society are kind of caught in the middle between thinking it's never justified and it is justified sometimes, and we don't want to commit to either position. Based on the fact that people go years and years on death row, right? So, what crimes if any, do you think are deserving of death? How about murder? If somebody murders your brother, do they deserve to die? What do you think?
Like if it was premeditated?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not talking about killing, right? So there's a difference between killing and murder. If somebody attacks you and you kill them in self-defense, that's not murder. Right? You're within your rights to defend yourself. But yeah, premeditated murder. Y'all think that person should be killed? Is that just? Or is that barbaric? Is that inhumane?
If murder is the punishment for murder, then why isn't a crime another punishment for the other crime?
Yeah, why not?
Like, if someone sexually assaults somebody, why don't we just sexually assault them then?
That's a good question. Or if somebody sexually assaults, rapes another person, why don't we castrate them? What do you think about that? Is that crazy? That's what the retributivist theory of punishment would say, right? Like, look, if you rape someone, you deserve something equally traumatic to happen to you. Is that barbaric? Or is that just?
I don't know, premeditated and you're taking like an innocent life, this person didn't do anything, then yeah. I was like, why not? I don't get it, it's their consequence. Like if you wanna tie it back to the other theories we talked about, that's their consequence for what they did, their bad action.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, and like I said before, it's too dangerous to release them again. I mean, the worst, I guess the scapegoat would just be keep them in prison for life, but they're probably gonna be murdered in prison, most likely.
Yeah,
because
depending
of
on their crime,
actions,
right?
Because the people are gonna be upset.
Pedophiles do not do well in prison, right? They're normally not treated very well. Does it change if the person has some sort of disability or mental illness? Is death a fitting punishment for them then? Or perhaps should we lean more into rehabilitation, if that is a possibility? Do you think a lot of people can change? Or do you think people's characters are relatively fixed? This is a very difficult question.
I feel like people like that, it depends on like the severity of the crime, because I know like in the cases of like school shootings, a lot of those kids have something going on. And it's just a really hard one for that. But, oh my god, I lost my train of thought, never mind, it's such a hard topic to bring up.
I know, and it's the morning too, so I don't hold anybody. Yeah, I mean, I think we want to hold out hope for redemption for a lot of people, right? People who are struggling with, addictions or drug abuse or who have had traumatic experiences in their lives.
Okay.
Like a lot of these things kind of twist people in very harmful ways that are harmful to them and others, right? We seem to think that there's something we can do to like get through to people and get them to change, even if they do something that we think is bad.
I think people like that should be put into long-term living facilities. Like, if
Interesting,
there's
okay.
a chance of rehabilitation, I don't think they're gonna be able to go back out in public after something like that.
Yeah, maybe it depends on the
'Cause
severity.
not only is it dangerous, but they just cause themselves more damage mentally by doing that action. So that's probably unfixable after that point. They need to put life, and that's really traumatizing to people. Like a lot of cases of military PTSD, they don't get over that. Some of them.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
feel like
Sometimes.
If in those cases, if they really didn't need to, and if like they're severely mentally ill, I think a long-term living facility would be better. There's places like that, like what people like to use as like asylum and all that crud, but just it would be safer for the community and also them, because they're being taken care of and they're not hurting themselves. They're not
Right.
hurting anyone else.
Yeah, they're in an insulated environment, right? Who here is against the death penalty? Does anybody say we should never do it? Inhumane, bad. Okay, anybody for it? For the people who are for it, I want to come back to the question, what crimes are deserving of death? Murder is the obvious example, right, that Pojman's been talking about, right? If you murder someone, premeditated murder, you deserve to die. But there are other crimes? What do you think? Are there other crimes deserving of death? I'm going to skip these first two for now. One of the things that Pojman argues in this piece is we should expand the scope of the death penalty. More than just capital crimes should result in death. And what he has in mind is somebody on Wall Street who steals, let's say, 1,000 old people's pensions, and they can no longer live their lives. Maybe that person should be put to death. What do you think? Or somebody who is a serial rapist, has raped 13 women. Should they be put to death? How about somebody who has kidnapped 3 different children throughout their lives, been arrested each time? Should they be killed? Should sex traffickers be killed? What do you think? Do you agree that we should expand the scope?
I feel like if the action is going to long-term result in death of a lot of people, then yeah, it could be another one. Like
Okay.
suicide, like if you get raped, a lot of people commit suicide after that, usually. With sex trafficking, if you arrest them, you release them, they're probably just going to go back doing it. They're not going to stop doing that. That's what makes them money.
Right.
They don't care about people. Those people don't care. They look at people like animals. They trade them.
I think it's like the largest growing illegal business, right? Sex trafficking. Besides drugs, I don't know if drugs is bigger now, but yeah.
Also, a lot of people who like run sex trafficking and stuff, they continue to run it while they're in prison.
Yeah.
They have ways to contact the people outside, and they continue to run things. So why would we let them continue to do the thing that got them in prison in the first place?
So do you think the scope should be expanded like Pojman
Yeah.
suggests?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does anybody think this is just barbaric and crazy? Like, why are we even talking about this? I bet some of you do, but you're not courageous enough to say it to my face. That's okay. In any case, this is a real issue, right, that is facing us as a country. This is a thing that you're probably going to have to contend with in some small part in your own life. I'm sure you've had the desire to kill someone, right? On a really bad day, somebody's really ticking you off, you're like, oh, I wish I could just run them over right now. I felt that while I've been driving. I don't get road rage, but people are just such bad drivers that I'm like, oh, I just want to run that person off the road right now. I know, it's terrible. But this is something that we're still wrestling with as a country. Whether or not we think this policy is morally and legally justifiable. Pojman wants to expand the scope. He thinks that it's morally justifiable. One thing you might ask is, a lot of people, if we're going along with the deterrence theory of punishment, commit crimes because they don't fear the punishment that they're going to endure. Do you get that sense of people in our own country? Are people really worried about punishment or going to jail or anything like that? Should they be? Should we make our persons harsher, or should we lean more into rehabilitation? What do you think? These are hard questions.
I feel like it's situational. Like what we're talking about specifically with the person committing crime, mental illness, or are they mentally
Yeah.
stable?
What is their history like? You know, what kinds of experiences have they undergone? Yeah? Yeah, I think that makes sense. Alright, well, it doesn't seem like you're all that willing to talk today, so I'll let you go early. Think about this, okay? It's an interesting idea. Talk about it with your friends. Ask them what they think. If you thought this was controversial, we're talking about an even more controversial subject on Thursday. So come to class deciding whether or not you think eugenics should be supported. And read the article defending it, okay?